Hi, this is Ron Cipcic, and this is the first part in a two-part series on open market operations. In this particular segment, we're going to take a look at how the Federal Reserve System increases the potential money supply by injecting excess reserves into the banking system. To begin to understand this process, we need to go back to this diagram, which is now shown, which shows the difference between the actual money supply, or the actual level of deposits, and the potential money supply, or the potential level of deposits. Again, it's very, very important to remember that most money in today's modern economies is in the form of deposits, not paper money. So when we talk about money, we're talking about the level of deposits. Remember, deposits are money. In one of our earlier lessons, we learned that banks actually create deposits when they make loans. So when banks loan funds out of their excess reserves, the actual money supply moves closer to its potential. Remember, the potential money supply is the money supply that would exist if there were no excess reserves in the banking system, if all funds that could be loaned out were loaned out, and if there were no currency. So to get the actual money supply to move closer to its potential, banks need to make loans from their excess reserves, which leads to a very, very, very surprising and important revelation that it's banks, privately owned banks, who create money when they extend credit or create loans. So it's bank loans that actually expand the actual money supply. All right? So the question before us now is not how the actual money supply moves within its given potential. We've already looked at that question. In this particular lesson, we want to take a look at how the actual money supply, how the potential money supply can be moved outward, how the outside circle can be moved outward. And the reason we care about this is anything that can move the outside circle out will make more room for the inside circle to grow. And what you're going to learn in this particular lesson, that it's the Federal Reserve System, who we'll call the Fed, we'll call the Federal Reserve System by its nickname, the Fed, that it's the U.S. Central Bank, it's the Federal Reserve System, which expands the outside circle by injecting excess reserves into the banking system. Now, before we go any further with this, let's go back and let's take a look at the calculation for the potential money supply, because if we see how the potential money supply is calculated, we can better understand how it can be manipulated. All right, so remember, back in one of our earlier lessons, we actually calculated this aggregate called the potential money supply. What is that equal to? It's equal to the monetary base divided by the percentage reserve requirement. So the monetary base divided by the percentage reserve requirement equals what? Equals the potential money supply, or the potential level of deposits, or the fully expanded level of deposits. Remember that the monetary base is made up of currency in circulation. In circulation means currency being held outside the banking system, plus bank reserves. In that earlier video, I made a big point out of the fact that the monetary base is a key monetary idea. Why? Well, if the potential money supply is a function of the monetary base and the reserve ratio, anything that affects these variables will ultimately affect the potential money supply. Now, let me back into this a little bit. What would be a way that the potential money supply could increase? Well, one way to increase the potential money supply would be to what? Lower the percentage reserve requirement. Hold the monetary base constant, lower the percentage reserve requirement. Now, how would that work? Well, let's say the reserve ratio now is 10%, and say that the Fed decides to lower that to 5%. Well, what effectively has happened? Many, many, many billions and billions and billions of dollars would go from being required reserves to being now excess reserves. In other words, just overnight, with one change of policy, banks would be in a position to create an extraordinary number of new loans. Now, I'm going to quickly add the Fed rarely changes the percentage reserve ratio because it's way too powerful. When you change the reserve ratio, you affect every bank in the banking system. So the Fed doesn't do that very often. In fact, in the United States, that hasn't happened since the early 1990s. The Fed generally does not use the percentage reserve ratio as a monetary policy tool. It is one of the tools. It generally doesn't change it, though. However, mainland China actually uses that tool quite regularly. Actually, changing the reserve ratio is considered a bit primitive, but mainland China uses it and uses it quite effectively. The United States, the central bank, the Fed, does not use it. So if you don't want to change the reserve ratio, you can see the formula dictates you have to change the monetary base. Well, let's take a look at this. Again, if we take the monetary base, we divide it by the percentage reserve ratio, we get what? We get the potential money supply. Well, if the Fed wants to increase the potential money supply, does not want to change the reserve ratio, it has to increase the monetary base. Specifically, what would the Fed do? The Fed would increase the level of bank reserves. And you go, well, how can the Fed do that? Well, I'm going to show you. This is going to be open market operations today. Think of reserves like coffee beans. You go, what do you mean? Well, coffee beans are the raw material of making coffee. You can think of reserves as the raw material of making money. That with reserves, excess reserves, banks can make what? Banks can make loans, and when these loans are made, there can be an extension of credit. And when there's an extension of credit, new deposits are created through what is called the deposit expansion multiplier process, which has already been discussed in one of your lessons. So what we're going to learn as we move forward through this lesson is the exact method that the Fed uses to increase reserves in the banking system. So let's just summarize. Let me go back to black here. By increasing the level of reserves in the banking system, the Fed can effectively what? Increase the monetary base, and by increasing the monetary base, it can increase the potential money supply. Now, what we're going to focus on is how does the Fed actually increase the level of reserves in the banking system. I hasten to add the potential money supply is not the actual money supply. The Fed does not directly control the actual money supply in the United States. That is decided not by the government, not by the Fed, but by banks. Banks and borrowers determine how much money will be borrowed. Okay? Very, very, very important idea. Okay, now let me go ahead and dive right into open market operations. So let's get right into how does the Fed actually increase the level of reserves in the banking system? How does it push the outside circle out? How does it push more reserves into the banking system? Now, think of the Fed as a pumping station. Think of the Fed as being able to stick a hose into the banking system and pump reserves in, which makes credit conditions easier. It makes it easier for banks to make loans. Or think of the Fed as a pumping station that can stick a hose into the banking system, suck reserves out, and make it more difficult for the banking system to extend credit. So the Fed's job is not to manipulate the actual money supply. It can't do that. The Fed's job is to manipulate the level of reserves in the banking system, and by manipulating the level of reserves, affect credit conditions and thereby affect the quantity of money that exists in the banking system. We'll also see that one of the Fed's key ideas or key goals is to manipulate interest rates, which is the price of borrowed money. Okay? Now, before I go into the actual methodology for open market operations, I need to make a very, very important distinction. The federal government and the Fed are not the same thing. The federal government is part of government. The Fed is not part of the government. Okay? So when we talk about open market operations and I begin to talk about what the Fed's going to do, it's going to be very easy to confuse the Fed and the federal government. We have to separate those two in our heads right now. The Fed and the federal government are two different entities. The government, the federal government in particular, does two things with funds. We learned way back when we studied the complex circular flow that the federal government engages in what we call purchases. The federal government also pays out what are called government transfers. Government transfers are simply where the government takes funds from one party and gives that money away to another party. Now, where do the funds come from for purchases and transfers? Well, we learned that at least on paper, governments can collect business taxes. So business taxes, which of course come from the business sector, are a source of funds. And then businesses, not only businesses pay taxes, but households pay taxes. So you have personal taxes. So personal taxes and business taxes are prime ways that the government finances its purchases and transfers. But that's not the end of the story. Remember that the federal government in particular borrows from the credit market. And so we called this net government borrowing. The federal government in particular, as you know, has borrowed trillions of dollars to finance its spending and transfers. How does the federal government actually borrow? It borrows by selling what are called bonds. So let's make a note of that. The federal, this is U.S., the federal government borrows by what? By selling or issuing bonds. Now these bonds come in all sorts of varieties, all sorts of face values and interest rates, and this is not a quick course in finance. So we're going to make no attempt to explain bond financing and all the different nuances of that. But let me just lay out very quickly some basic ideas about government bonds. So let's just draw a government bond here. And this bond, let's say, has a face value of 1,000. The face value is the amount that is being borrowed. So the face value is the amount that is being borrowed. So essentially, when the government sells a bond, it is taking out a loan. It's borrowing $1,000 from whoever buys that bond. Let's say that that bond has a coupon rate of 3%. You go, what's the coupon rate? The coupon rate is the annual interest rate on that bond. So that bond is going to pay 1,000. I'll just go over here and make a note. It's going to pay 1,000 times 3%. That bond is going to pay interest, or what's called the coupon, dollar coupon of $30 annually. So this bond will pay $30 a year annually for as long as the bond is active. Let's say that this bond is a 10-year bond. So the maturity date, the year we're in now is 2014, but let's say that this is a 10-year bond. This bond would mature in the year 2024. Okay, so what would happen here is the government would issue this bond, and let me go ahead and scroll down here and show you something. The government would issue this bond, and every year for 10 years, let me just T1, T2, T3, T10, 10 years out, every year the bondholder of record would get $30 on 1,000, face value of 1,000. And then in the last year, the government would repay the bondholder of record $1,030. The $1,030 is what? Made up of $1,000 in what is called principal and the last interest payment of $30, which is the last coupon. The coupon is the last interest payment. So this bond would pay 10 $30 payments over 10 years, and the bondholder of record would receive the $1,000 repaid in 10 years. Now you can't, if you can't cash this bond in early. The kind of bond I'm talking about is a 10-year note, which means it's a contract. The government agrees to borrow for 10 years, and the lender can't redeem the bond early, this type of bond that we're talking about. However, the borrower could sell it any time. The lender could sell it any time. So this bond buyer might buy it, hold it for a couple years, and then decide to sell it. After all, you can't drive a bond to work. So let's say that you're holding bonds, your car breaks down, you want to liquidate some of your bond portfolio, and you want to buy a car. All right, well, you can take some of your bonds and sell them in the bond market, and you're going to be a seller of bonds in the bond market. However, the bond market you're selling in is called the open market or secondary bond market. So let me go ahead and write some of this stuff out so you have it. So if the bond is sold before maturity, it's sold where? In the open market or secondary market. So the secondary, all right, we got to spell words correctly, or students won't believe we know what we're talking about. So secondary or open bond market. Once the bond is issued by the government, when it's first issued, that's called the primary bond market. When it's first sold by the government, it's sold into what's called a primary bond market through certain brokers on Wall Street. Once the bond, though, is purchased by someone, it can be sold and resold, sold and resold, sold and resold over and over again till it matures. That's called the secondary or open bond market. So this is the market where sellers my pen tool isn't working real hot today. Where sellers and buyers of issued bonds, in other words, bonds that have already been issued, interact. So every day there are literally millions of people out there selling bonds, and every day there's literally millions of people out there buying bonds. So the U.S. bond market is very large and sophisticated, and one of the largest segments of that bond market is the U.S. government bond market. The U.S. government bonds are very, very popular. Why? Because they're relatively risk-free and they earn a pretty good return. Think about it. If this bond is paying 3% on 1,000, that's better interest than you can earn at most banks today on a simple savings account. Plus, these bonds are very, very, very safe. What is the last institution in the world that you expect to go out of business? I'm guessing that would be the U.S. federal government. The U.S. federal government is probably the last government in the world you would expect that is going to fall, and it's been very faithful in the repayment of its debts. It's been very credible. So very few people fear that the United States government will not honor its debts. It has the ability to tax. This ability is called the IRS, and it has good guns. It has a very powerful mechanism for not only collecting taxes but enforcing its laws. Okay? So government bonds, particularly U.S. government bonds, are considered very, very safe by financial investors, and therefore there's a huge bond market, and it's very, very what we would call liquid. It's easy to sell bonds and easy to buy bonds in the United States today. Okay? Now, why do we call Open market operations, open market operations. Well, the open market is the open bond market. So let's go ahead and dive into the monetary policy side of this. Now this is where you have to separate federal government from the Fed. So how does the Fed conduct open market operations? How does the Fed conduct open market operations? How? Well, here's what the Fed does. The Fed buys bonds. Where does it buy them? It buys bonds in the secondary bond market. So let's say the Fed buys $100 million of bonds, of government bonds. Doesn't matter really what the Fed buys, but the Fed likes to buy U.S. government bonds because they're very, very liquid. Okay? And they can be easily bought, which means they can be easily what? They can be easily resold. So the Fed buys $100 million of U.S. government bonds. Where? Where? In the secondary or open bond market. Now you say to yourself, why would the Fed do that? How is that going to move the potential money supply out? What does that have to do with monetary policy? Let me show you. So now I'm going to draw a couple T accounts here. This is going on the left, this is going to be the Fed's books. Remember, the Fed is the central bank. It is not the federal government. Huge idea. So the Fed's books, and then over here we've got the banking systems books. Now I'm going to put the whole banking system together. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and do the accounting here. When the Fed buys $100 million worth of bonds, it now has an asset called bonds on its balance sheet. Remember, assets are shown on the left side of a bank's balance sheet, and the Fed is a bank. It's the central bank. So these bonds that were purchased now show up on the Fed's books as an asset. The Fed goes ahead and pays the bond sellers, and those bond sellers now have a deposit that they didn't have before. So whoever sold that those $100 million in bonds to the Fed now have $100 million in their account. Now here is the very interesting point. This deposit was essentially created out of thin air. You know, what do you mean it was created out of thin air? This deposit did not come at the expense of another bank in the banking system. Effectively, the Fed has created this bookkeeping entry out of thin air. Now let that sink in. The Fed created $100 million in money, deposits our money, out of thin air. You go, well, who gives the Fed this right? Congress. You go, well, who gives Congress the right to give this to the Fed? The Constitution. If you read the Constitution, Congress has the right to create money constitutionally. In the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, the Congress delegated this right to the Fed. This quasi-governmental, freaky, weird entity called the Fed, kind of part government, part private sector. This entity called the Fed has constitutional authority to create money where it didn't previously exist. Way back early in our money and banking principles, what did we say? We said that the primary form of money is deposits. The primary form of money is deposits. The Fed just created a $100 million deposit out of thin air. Now, that $100 million deposit, like any deposit, is going to create reserves. and in this case it's going to be 100 million. And those reserves are going to show up over here on the Fed's books as a liability. It's almost as if, well, it's not almost as if, it is as if those reserves are on deposit with the Fed. Remember, a bank's reserves can be in two basic forms: vault cash or a deposit with the Federal Reserve System. So effectively, these reserves show up as a liability on the Fed's books, and notice that the accounting closes, the accounting system closes, everything balances. Left side equals the right side, left side equals the right side, the banking system is in balance. Now, what has happened here? The Fed has essentially created new reserves. The Fed has increased the monetary base. And didn't we say that if the Fed can increase the monetary base, it can increase the potential money supply? Why? Well, banks are now in a position to create more loans. You know the rest of the story from here. There is something called the deposit expansion multiplier process. So if the actual money multiplier is, let's say, 5.6, then what's going to happen here? Though this deposit creates reserves. Most of these reserves are going to be loaned out. Those loans are going to create deposits. Those deposits are going to create reserves. Those reserves are going to lead to loans, and you're going to have an expansion. Well, if the multiplier is 5.6, then what is total deposits in the banking system going to go up by? Total deposits in the banking system could go up by as much as $560 million. So effectively what the Fed did is it pumped reserves into the banking system that did not previously exist, and then it trusts that banks, because they're profit-seeking entities, they make profits by making loans, that banks will take these reserves and begin to make loans, and guess what happens? The Fed has moved the potential out, and the actual begins to move out behind it. All right? So what we see then is the Fed has the ability to influence the level of money by pumping more reserves into the banking system. Now, of course, this could work in reverse. If the Fed were to turn around and sell bonds that it had previously purchased, these positives would become negatives. If the Fed began to sell bonds, somebody's account would go down in the banking system. Well, if somebody's account goes down in the banking system and there's no offsetting deposit, if there's a withdrawal but there's no offsetting deposit, then all of these would be negatives. And if deposits and reserves go down, if reserves in the banking system go down, then the banking system does not have the capacity to create as much credit and liquidity. Okay? All right, well, this is a good place to stop in our first segment, our first part on open market operations. What we're going to be looking at in the second segment is we're going to take a closer look at this expansion process, but then we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to be looking at how the Fed's actions influence interest rates. And we're going to see later that interest rates end up affecting spending, and of course spending ultimately affects something called GDP or prices. See you then.